Been reading A Course in Miracles?
Yes.
Did you read this chapter that we're looking at today?
No.
No? Honesty is really good. It's one of the primary characteristics of a teacher of God. I'd like to suggest that in the future, you think about reading the chapter that we're going to be talking about again in advance. We're doing obviously one chapter a month, 3 years. And also I'd like to make an assignment. The assignment is, I'd like you to find either just one sentence or a paragraph in that chapter that really stands out for you, that sort of says something to you, and kind of mark it or something so that we can talk about it. So chapter 3 is called the innocent perception. Now there are other words that we might use besides innocent perception. We might talk about a perfect vision or spiritual vision or true perception. This section contains a lot of information about the difference between perception and knowledge, and a lot about judgment, as also a lot about forgiveness. So actually I want to tell you about an experience I had 31 years ago that really showed me something about judgment. And I had a death experience. That's the way I describe it. It was a death experience. It was a very profound death experience. I didn't even know you can come back. I didn't know it was possible. It happened with the use of heavy-duty psychotropic drugs. I don't mind telling you, because that's what happened. This was in 1976. It was under the supervision of a psychiatrist. I don't recommend that anyone ever do this at all, especially without supervision. I wouldn't recommend that you would do it, but it did provide a death experience, which I really left here, or I didn't even know what was having the experience. Now something remembers the experience, otherwise I couldn't talk about it, right? But one of the things that happened as a part of that, just one of the little pieces of that, was that when I came back from it, and the same thing happened, I might add, in 2007, I had another experience. This time was with encephalitis. I was in a coma for well over a week. That's a little bit like what happened with Eben Alexander, and that he describes in Proof of Heaven, except I didn't have that same kind of really outer space kind of experience he had in 2007. In 1976, I did. But one of the things that happened when I came back, I couldn't talk. And that's true from both of these. And the reason I couldn't talk was because I realized that anything I said would be a construct. I mean, anything I said would be an attempt to try to put into words something that didn't fit into words. I mean, words wouldn't work. And of course, as words are symbols of symbols, and thus twice removed from reality. So another way that I could say that was that I realized that I couldn't make any judgments. Because any kind of, any statement practically was a judgment. So the Course is going to say a lot about judgment in this. Actually, I want to read from I listened to this chapter 12 times on the cassette before, not cassette, because I'm still living in the last century. That's true more ways than one. It's actually in today as I'm driving in from upstate, I'm listening to it. Got through twice more with driving in. And also, if you're going to be in the class, you can have whatever version of the Course you want, but I really highly recommend that you have the same one that we're working with here, which is the one from the Foundation for Inner Peace, and this is the one we're working with. Right? So this is on page 51. It's paragraph 5, and it's as the very end, the last couple of sentences. Actually, I'll start with sentence 8. Your self is still in peace, even though your mind is in conflict. You have not yet gone back far enough. I'll explain what that means in a minute. And that is why you become so fearful. As you approach the beginning, You feel the fear of the destruction of your thought system upon you as if it were the fear of death. Now that's what happened in the 1976 experience. By that I mean, as I began to go into the experience and begin to let go, I began to disappear. And that's very frightening. I mean, what's frightening, I mean, the ego began to disappear, the personality, the individual. The death, and that was a death. I mean, that this was the death of, that would be no more. I thought, actually this happened, it was in the jungles in Chiapas in southern Mexico, and working with some of the Indians called a little death, and even though there was a psychiatrist there, I thought they screwed up and accidentally killed one of us. Because there was no way back. I mean, I didn't see any way to get back. I was very, very surprised when I did come back. So, as I went into it, then I didn't even know what was having the experience, but it was very, very, the title of the experience is called Holy Hell. It's in the book Missouri Mystic. And Lily Cutts, didn't you just read that? This book, Lily Cutts. Read that this week, or recently?
I'm almost finished with it.
Almost finished with it, yeah. Anyhow, if we go back to this sentence here, as you approach the beginning, you feel the fear of the destruction of your thought system. What's the beginning? The beginning is the point at which the separation occurred, okay? So it's the point at which we begin to see ourselves as being separate or different or other than. And the main way that we do that, of course, is that we have a body. And then not only do we have a body, but we have all the accoutrements that go with the body, which that would include a personality, right? And then whatever's involved with regarding that particular personality. Last time we were here, I talked a bit about Anita Morjani's book, Dying to Be Me, and even Alexander's Proof of Heaven. Both were talking about very similar kinds of experiences, especially Anita Morjani, I think, in terms of what the Course in Miracles is really describing. So there's never going to be a Jon Mundy in heaven. There will never be a you in heaven. There'll be a you, but it's not going to be you as the individual separated personality, name. You know, we're really going back home again. That's what the Course is all about. It's about going back home again and remembering God, and that's what Jesus did. Jesus, you could say, is the first, but we don't know he's the first, but in the Western world we look at that as who completed the atonement. So the atonement is he gets all the way back home by remembering God, which is what we're supposed to do. In that first experience that I had, it was hellish. I mean, the first part of it was hellish. Actually, I had the experience more than once. And so when I had it the second and third and fourth times, and I would see what was happening, I would just run and jump off the cliff. That's what you do. You run in, you jump off the cliff, and you disappear. And I can't tell you about those other times because I disappeared. But I can tell you about the first one because I was so terrified. It's the terror that remembers it. I think Carolyn Mice in one of her books
Yes.
Talks about how we remember the traumas. Yeah, we remember my first memory that I can really remember, they go way back. At 4 years old, my sister and I were on a horse and a pony actually, and the saddle slipped and went underneath the belly of the pony, and so we were underneath the pony's prancing, and we're panicked, of course, you know. So that's the first memory, and the first you can go. It's the first trauma, right? We remember the traumas, which is why I also remember that 76 experience so really well. Also because I wrote it down right afterwards. I think if I hadn't written it down right afterwards, it would really be pretty. Anita Morjani said that she had to write her experience down right away, and even Alexander said he had to write his experience down right away, so that they wouldn't. Otherwise, it fades just like a dream fades, right? It has some dreamlike qualities to it, right? But the point is that it was the point of separation and the point of break. So when it says here, as you approach the beginning, this is you're going back. The Course says you go back as you go forward, right? As we go forward, that is, as we progress in our understanding, we're really going back to the beginning. That is, especially in chapter 4, which we'll see next time, the Course talks a lot about what it calls reversal in thinking. So reversal in thinking means that we are literally reversing our thinking. We're going back. We're no longer making up a world. We're going back to the memory of the truth of who we are. So as we go forward, we go back. We go home, in other words, or we're going back home again. It's very, very simple. But on the personal ego level, that becomes very scary because on that level, it looks like we're losing everything, and you are. I mean, you are, but you're not losing a thing. As we said last time, what do you lose when you lose an illusion? Obviously, you lose nothing when you lose an illusion except an illusion, and so it's like waking up from a dream. So I mean, you're literally coming home again, and you're really coming back to yourself, not the self that got created in the world, but the self that you always have been. And, or another word we could use here is soul, which the word soul doesn't appear very often in the Course, but it does appear in this chapter, right? And it says you cannot lose your soul, but you can lose your memory of it, right? So a lot of the Course is about memory. It is about remembering the truth of who we are. It's coming back to the memory of our reality that you can never lose, but you can lose the memory of it. So we're getting our memory back again, which is really, really exciting because actually as you do the Course, it's a very progressive, it's a very, very slow process. And that's because we are so far removed. I mean, we've had decades, each of us, of building up of an illusion about who we are. So undoing that illusion is obviously going to take us a bit of time. What was so traumatic about my experience was that it happened like that. In that first experience at least, it happened like that. So I have a lot of sympathy for somebody who would sort of, let's say, die suddenly. Because you're here, you're not here. So then there's like putting that pieces together again. That's why I think we should be really, really happy that to be in a hospice program someday and very slowly and gently releasing and letting go of all of the accoutrements of who we thought that we were, so that we really can experience coming home again, right? Well, I told this. Tell me if I told this story, Charles. I have a friend, Emily, Reverend Emily, who works with a seminary here, who also works with hospice, who tells this story about, she goes to see a friend of hers who's dying, and she's counseling with him, or not counseling with him, she's just visiting. She's there because he's dying and he's a friend, right? He couldn't think of her name, which was interesting. When she walked into the room, and it's like, they're hugging and kissing, and he said, I don't remember your name, it's like, but it really doesn't matter. And he said, no, it really doesn't matter what the name is, it's just, what really matters is that we recognize each other. And she said, at that point, his former secretary came into the room, and she sees him, and she looks at him, and I forgot what his name, we'll call him Charles. She says, when she walks, she says, Charles, you're absolutely radiant, right? And he sort of acknowledged, but he didn't realize what they said. And then when she left, he turned to my friend, Reverend Emily, and said, what did she say when she walked in the room? She said, you're absolutely radiant. And he says, oh, Em, we all are. We all are. We're all radiant, So the task is being, but here you are getting at the death's door and you see that everyone's radiant, right? Because everybody is radiant. But that's not the way we see it, because we see all the judgments that come in, and they're constant. It's just like trying to stop the judgments is really, really, I was, early this morning I found I love little short sentence in the 3-word sentence, right? And they're with, love cannot judge, period. Love cannot judge. And lesson 347 says, judgment is a weapon I would use against myself. Isn't that right? Judgment is a weapon I use against myself. So it doesn't make any difference what the judgment's about. Now, obviously, there's all kinds of judgments we have to make all day long, which have absolutely no consequence of any significant importance. What we're really talking about, of course, is those kind of judgments that involve some sort of condemnation, where we are attacking our brothers or attacking our sisters. It doesn't have to be literal, it doesn't have to be physical, it doesn't even have to be verbal. It's just a thought even that occurs in the mind. And there's a line someplace in the Course where it talks about our not wishing anyone well. And you know, it's like, oh my God, you know, how many of us have not wished someone else well? You know, and so if we're, even if we're not wishing somebody else well, that's kind of an attack that we are placing upon them. But then, of course, what happens, of course, is that judgment is a weapon I use upon myself. So it's myself that I'm judging in this whole process. So we're really learning how to stop this by just being repeatedly aware of how much it comes up, and then making this choice to see another way, to go another way. So let's look at the first part of this. I have a reverence for this book. I don't get wet here. It is not a holy book. But what it says is. So if you want to look at the first page with me. Innocence or true perception means that you never misperceive and always see truly. More simply, it means that you never see what does not exist and always sees what does. So that's taking us back home again. If we see what doesn't exist, then we're seeing something we've made up in this world. That's a part of our construct, is the thing that we've made up. It's not that we're seeing what reality is at all. We're not seeing home, we're not seeing heaven, right? So, I know I asked the question, can you imagine that there's anything nicer than seeing only the truth, right? Going on down to, judgment is the process on which perception lasts. Now, the important word here, I think, is process. So judgment is the process of when perception lasts. Now, also I want to read you a bit about, I moved things around with the last one, I should have done consciousness. Let's just start talking about consciousness. Well,
To the right.
That's right next to-
Perception
below
involves selectivity.
over there at the very bottom of the page. Thank you. Consciousness, the level of perception, was the first split entered into the mind after the separation, making the mind a perceiver rather than a creator. Consciousness is correctly identified as a domain of the ego. Now, this was very difficult for me when I first came across this. The reason it was difficult was at that time, I was teaching courses on the works of Pierre de Chardin at the New School here in New York City. And Chardin talks all about consciousness. I don't know whether you know who Chardin was. He was a French Jesuit priest, paleontologist, archaeologist, I mean just everything. Came with this brilliant theory of evolution, which, and being a Catholic priest, coming up with a theory regarding evolution didn't work very well in the Catholic Church, so his works were forbidden from being published, which made him very popular. Because, you know, the first thing everybody wants to know, what in the world did he say that he got the church so upset about? Well, he was saying that he was going along with the theory of evolution, but his theory of evolution concerned that within, that as we go through different stages and levels of consciousness, there's a deeper within, is the way that he talked about it. So that by the time we get up to the human, there's an incredible within in terms of the awareness. And then he posited that there was something, another step beyond the humankind, but beyond human, right? And he said that step was as great as the step from animal to human. Okay, so it's that big of a step, right? Which, I mean, it's like making that divide is humongous to be able to make that step. So it's really stepping out of the human dimension altogether. I think it's interesting when we think of some dimension that's got beyond us. We put wings on them. You know, we could make them angel. We give them another level of freedom, right? This is just symbolic. It's all as it's symbolic, but it's a way of thinking of something that transcends the physical dimension as we understand it, and yet we still have eyes, so it's very hard for us to imagine. Ultimately, the Course is just talking about mind. The mind doesn't have a form, so it's really hard for us to conceptualize something which doesn't have a form. You can't do it, but you can realize the mind does not actually have a form, right? And yet we do participate of mind. You can imagine yourself not having a body, but you cannot imagine yourself not having a mind. You got a mind, right? And it's the mind, which is this wonderful thing, which links us back to God again. If I were to had a chart, I'd never used charts or drawing, but I've been nice maybe sometimes. But at the top we have spirit. We'll draw a line below. We have mind. We draw a line below that. We have spirit. We have body. Okay. So mind and body are connected, and mind and spirit are connected. Ultimately, the body doesn't mean anything. It's nothing, because it literally has no reality except for a little moment in space-time. And it's just a moment. Out, brief candle, life support player that struts and frets the tower upon the stage. So the truth is that this little body-mind thing that's going on is not the truth of the reality of who we are. The mind-spirit thing is who we are. And there's something inside every one of us that knows that that's true. There's something inside. There's no one in whom the light has gone out completely. There's no one, of course, is actually who doesn't even that doesn't remember this. We all do remember it. You kind of forget it, but you can remember it. And later on here, it's going to talk about. Look at the bottom on the right of page 1. Okay. In the presence of knowledge, judgment is automatically suspended. This process enables recognition to replace perception. So perception is what happens with the body's eyes, but perception is also a form of separation or segregation. So one of the things that happens with perception is we have subject-object, right? We have self and we have other. So the Course is saying there is no other. That's why when we look at each other, although it looks like there's a lot of others out there, right? There's absolutely no difference between us. With the bodies, of course, there are, but those are just bodies, and they don't have any eternity in them, so they don't last, so that's not what's really important. And yet the whole world has forever gone insane about differences in bodies, right? Like it really makes a difference what color our skin is or something, which is just the level of absurdity that the ego can fall into. So we're really just getting back to the mind. And that's the part that remembers. Now, so what happens is the Course is talking about knowledge. Now, knowledge, I think it's very difficult for us to understand what knowledge is. But let's just understand there's a way of knowing that has nothing to do with perception. So it has nothing to do with like the collection of facts and the collection of information, the collection of data. It's nothing to do with anything that has to do with the world. This is really what the transcendentalists were talking about. And not just the transcendentalists, but a lot of the mystics also have been talking about this other way of knowing. And again, because of the word problem, because we don't really have words to describe it, it's really, really difficult to talk about this. But there's this kind of pure knowledge or awareness or knowing, and the word that's used here, which I think I've talked about before, this process enables recognition. Recognition. So it's like, in that experience that I had in '76, when I wrote about it, I called it an initiation. And that was a new word. that meant trial by fire, right? I mean, the waking up as a result of literally having a fire lit under you, because that's what it was like. It was like this initiation had gone, like this explosion had gone off in consciousness, like like an atomic explosion actually, which was really the thing that made it so horrific, because I thought it was an irreversible chain reaction that was happening and I couldn't stop it. That was the, in fact, is the way I got back in that first experience in '76, the way I got back was, and I don't know what point this occurred, but I eventually regained control of my vocal cords. And when I did regain control of the vocal cords, the first thing I started doing was screaming, "Stop it, stop it, stop it, stop it!" Just stop. And that was great, because I got a little back into the body at that point. And I was very, very far. Molecules are still spread out over vast distance, but at least it was a little bit more, there was something physical about it. The very fact that I could get a hold of the vocal cords for a moment and start screaming, "Stop it, stop it, stop it, stop it, stop it, stop it," right? And that began to fall. Actually, in Anita Moorjani's experience as well, if you've read her book, she talks about going away and then falling back. And when she would fall back, what she would fall backward to would be like a memory of her mother or her husband, or the emotional experience that was going on around her body as she was laying in the hospital. And that would pull her back, that connection to the world, if you will, the connection to the world pulls you back and you don't want to leave the world, but then she'd start to go away again. And every time she would describe, going away again, it's really, as she described it, which is the way I'm sure that it really is, it's much more. This is very peaceful, this is very freeing. In fact, you can imagine what it'd be like to literally be free of these bodies. Because these bodies are heavy. There's just no doubt, even if it's light, it's heavy. I mean, you've got to deal with, there's a line in the chorus where it says something about there's one thing you have not completely done, is that you have not completely forgotten the body, right? So you're like always holding on to it. In that experience I had, it was like I had, for a moment at least, let go of the body, right? But in that case, it was terrifying. I can imagine it's actually most of the descriptions of death experiences that people give, it's absolutely beautiful. And people don't want to come back. I mean, nobody wants to come back. And Anita Moorjani came back, but millions leave, you want to leave. And you want to go because of what you're beginning to see is so much more, well, a good word is freedom, right? Now there's an interesting thing about the word freedom in relationship to the Course in Miracles and free will, which appears also in this chapter that we were just looking at today. Free will seems like a difficult concept for us, because on the one hand you've got free will, but the free will that you've got is to do the will of God. Now this is where we get to the authority problem, which is also talked about in this chapter. So the authority problem is that the ego, doesn't want to do what God is asking us to do. And yet that's the only thing that you can do that's really going to give you freedom. One of the things I think that should happen to you as you study the Course, and this is a long, slow process, but one of the things that should happen to you, and this is a very good feeling, is that you feel really good, because you feel like you're moving in the right direction. That's the main thing. You're going in the right direction. You may not be there yet, and the exciting thing is, as I said, your foot is on the path, right? And if the foot is on the path and you're going in the right direction, then you should be experiencing increasing freedom from the dumb, stupid, idiotic types of choices that you've been making in the past. Freedom from judgment, right? I mean, just freedom from judgment. What an incredible freedom that is. Not to have that falling on you all the time, where you're constantly making these judgmental thoughts that occur in the mind. That's why the Course says, let the world be what it is. Just leave it alone. You leave other people alone, you let the world be, politics don't really matter, there's really nothing on that, because that's always been going on. Those kinds of dynamics and those kind of soap operas and dramas have They're always there. And if you want to get into living in one of those soap opera dramas, you can get into living one of those soap opera dramas, but then you know you're living in a soap opera drama, right? I'm not going to go into this, but I love my daughter. She broke up with her boyfriend this week, and it's just very, very difficult. And then by the end of the week, they're back together again, but it was a tough week. Right? It was a tough week. But it's happy. We're happy right now. And you're laughing because you know you've all been there, right?
Yes.
You've all gone through those experiences where you know the world was falling apart and you couldn't figure out you'd never get it put back together again. And
Oh, I thought you meant about my daughter, folks.
oh yeah, you know I didn't. Or your world, or whatever the story is, you know. We've all got our own soap operas and our own stories. But what you want to do with the court, you just want to look at it. You just want to see it. You just, this is what's happening. This is but don't play it. Don't get into it. Don't get into playing with it. Be there. I mean, be there for whoever is going through it, and let them know that you're there, that you love them, and that you're there. But please don't give them any advice, or try to direct the situation, because it's kind of got its own energy, and that the ego does not like that at all, as you all know. The last thing the ego wants to be is told what to do. This is the authority problem, right? We do not want to be told. That's why we have this thing going on with God, because we don't want to do what God's asking us to do. And yet at the same time, that's true. You know, the Course is saying that's the only way you're ever going to be happy, is to do exactly what God's asking you to do. And as a matter of fact, when you do exactly what God's asking you to do, this feels great. I mean, this feels like you're doing this wonderful, whatever it is that you're doing. You're making your contribution in the life journey process. It often involves some form of being selfless, right? In fact, I think it's sort of interesting that if you think about those characters in the course of history that we really regard as the greatest people in history, they're really the ones that are the most selfless. That is, I mean, that's sort of, it's the Mother Teresas and the Gandhis and the Martin Luther King Jr.'s and the ones who put not themselves but the greater whole first, the Albert Schweitzers and the Helen Kellers, that, you know, that saw that dimension. That strangely enough are the world's most interesting personalities. Here we are moving away from personality. We're moving away from creating our own. That's what, you know, don't, if you get into creating your own, you're creating an illusion. So it's not about money and cars and, you know, that kind of creation sort of thing. But it's about giving to the whole, and as we get to the whole, then that person, then you feel really good, and so does everybody else around. Also, I think another thing that should happen as you progress in doing the Course, you should notice that, and this may not happen all the time, of course, but because we never know what kind of circumstances we're in, but other people around you should start feeling better too. I mean, they should just, they should start, they just feel better. It just, in the family, in the work, or whatever the situation, and you're not doing anything. I mean, you're not manipulating anything. It's just, as you get deeper in touch with your own soul nature, that will be sensed and that will be felt by those around you, and they'll just respond to you in a really kind of automatically way. They'll just feel like something's good that's going on. So let me read a few passages more from the Course. Still on page 1 on the far right, the ego analyzes, the Holy Spirit accepts. I probably have said that here before. So the ego analyzes the hell out of everything. That's a part of the process, and it's not a matter of analysis. That's an intellectual, segregating, separating, evaluating. If it's a separating and segregating and evaluating, that may work fine in science, but it doesn't work on the soul level at all. The appreciation of wholeness comes only through acceptance. For to analyze means to break down and to separate out. So we're no longer breaking down and we're no longer separating. We're just experiencing that Well, my friend said, oh, we all are. We're all radiant. Next page. Victory. So this section talks about the difference between Christianity and the way the Course sees things. On two different occasions, it talks about a couple of incredible myths that got created in Christianity. The first one is the way that we understand the crucifixion, and how this concept of vicarious salvation became Christian doctrine is really kind of difficult to understand, but it's there and it's deep in Christian theology. So when I was ordained as a Methodist minister back in 1970, I decided that the Methodist Church was an open, liberal-minded church, and this would be a really good time for me. We had to write these essays about our theological positions, etc., as part of the ordination process. And it would be a good idea for me to talk about something I was struggling with, which was trying to understand the whole atonement process as it was described. This is pre-course, right? This is 5 years before I got the course, 6 years before I got the course. So I raised this question and said, I didn't understand it. I said, if I understand this correctly, an all-wise and loving God killed his only son because I'm bad. That doesn't sound very nice. This sounds actually like a pretty bloody, messy affair. This is a pretty cruel God that would come up with this kind of a concept. And what happened, to my surprise, well, I shouldn't have been surprised, I suppose, was this was not really perceived as an intellectual play of ideas and concepts, but it was, they questioned my readiness for ordination. Now, I still was ordained, but it was kind of like, keep your eye on him. You know, in terms of, I guess it was, what, I don't know how many, I resigned, and 19 years later I resigned, right? Because I kept thinking, actually, from the time I got the course in 75, 76, I kept thinking I would bring the course into the church, and it was really silly. It was like I really thought that I could do this, I thought that this would revolutionize. I talked about the Copernican revolution in church consciousness, you know. Of course, it never happened. You know, and as time went by, it just you know, I was just seen as a troublemaker rather than as somebody who was doing the right thing. So eventually it became necessary. The deeper I got into this, the more I realized, the more I preached from it. I started preaching the course every Sunday. It was just like and I made no bones about where my information is coming from. It's coming from this book called A Course in Miracles. And on the local parish level, it worked out pretty good because the folks kind of liked me and I kind of liked them until, I'll tell you, it ended one day. I'll tell you about the day it ended. It ended on Mother's Day, 1989, a day which will live in infamy. It's so long ago now, it doesn't matter. There was a new member of the church that I was serving. It was from Georgia, and she was a sort of a fundamentalist Methodist. And she was an opera singer. And this is Mother's Day, and so on Mother's Day, what you have in the church is everybody's there and their mothers. And she got to sing a song before I was going to preach. And she says, before I sing, there's something I want to say. And she proceeded to give her own little sermon, which included her saying, the message that I need to hear preached from this pulpit every single Sunday is the message of the saving grace of the sacrificial blood of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. And she says, I do not hear that message coming from this pulpit. And she was right. Because I had never ever preached sacrificial blood. I just didn't understand the concept of sacrificial blood. It didn't make any sense at all. And then she proceeded to sing, but there was so much gossip going on. I'm like, did she say? that you could hardly hear her singers. But she did her thing. And then that was really the thing. The next thing I know, she fired off a letter, and she had another person agreed with the two of them. They fired off letters to the bishop, and the next thing I know, I was in the bishop's office. And he'd been kind of gunning for me for a little while anyhow. But he didn't have any ammunition. Now he had ammunition. Something because I upset somebody. So I'll tell you about this. I went to see him. He had an office in White Plains, New York. I'm driving across the Tappan Zee Bridge, and I create a mantra in my head. The mantra is, do not attack this man, do not defend yourself. Do not attack this man, do not defend yourself. Do not attack this man, do not defend yourself. I get into his office, and I can't think of anything to say.
Mm-hmm.
I think of something, I think that's an attack. I think of something else, I think that's a defense.
Yeah.
So there was no, so I said what he wanted to hear, which was goodbye. Yeah. You know, just like that, after I've been 28 years in the ministry. It was over in one day, just like that, it ended. And there's another funny part to this story, which is sort of interesting, and I'll just, because it relates to All Faith Seminary, actually. And what it is I left there a little stressed. And you ever have this thing where you got to talk to somebody? I had to talk to somebody, you know. And the only person I could think of talking to was Rabbi Gelberman, who lived here in New York City. This is pre-cell phone days, right? And I just somehow knew he'd be home, and I just drove straight to his apartment office. And went up to his apartment and rang the doorbell, and by golly, he was home and he was alone, there wasn't anybody there. And I told him what happened, and he said, well, just start your own church. It had never occurred to me that I could do that. He says, I'll give you there was a little synagogue here in Greenwich Village over on Barrow Street. He says, I'll give you the little synagogue to start in, free for a year on rent. And we did. 3 months later, we started, it was called All Faith, not All Faith, Interfaith Fellowship. We did that for 13. Anyhow, all good, right? I mean, it was exactly what, that's always good. It's always the thing that's supposed to happen. It happens even when it looks like you get fired. You know, I know another guy once that had gotten fired from his job, and he walks out of the front of the building, and he throws up this prayer, goes, help! and he hears this voice that, you just got help. You weren't happy here. You know, and you're going to find some place where you can be happier afterwards. You know, so what looks like distress on the outside is really the soul sings. You know, there's this line in the chorus where it says, "What you regard as some of your greatest advances, and then some of your biggest setbacks," right? Like getting that really nice inheritance. Right? And some of your what you think of as your biggest advances, like getting that, have been some of your deepest setbacks. Right? So you really never know in this life journey process. So don't get too excited about success, and don't get too excited about failure, either one. They're just a part of what's going along the way. And as we move to a higher spiritual level, we begin to see that more and more. So it becomes much easier to just not take anything too seriously. Okay, back to, so the Course straightens out the vicarious salvation situation. It says that there's no way that God would ever have done this. What counts is not the crucifixion, what counts is the resurrection, right? Which is really, and that's kind of resurrection what I was just talking about. You're liberated as a part of this, right? Jesus' body could be killed, but that doesn't mean anything because they can't kill him. The body, the last line of Martin Luther's hymn, "A Mighty Fortress," which some of you may know, is, "The body they may kill, God's truth abideth still." Right? So God's truth abideth still. Just something in the physical world has been eliminated, doesn't mean anything. The other myth that is mentioned in this chapter in terms of traditional religion, it's at the end of the chapter, but I'll just mention that because we're talking about myths, is the one of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. And all it says about that is that that never happened. But, I mean, God did not kick Adam and Eve out of the garden. That's the way we did it. What happened was we left of our own accord. We decided to. We made the exit. God did not push us out. And now we're struggling to get back in again. But we've made such a complicated world that it's a really difficult process to get back in again. That's why I think you think the course is complicated. I mean, you think the course is difficult, and it really looks that way. But obviously, as you do it and do it and do it, you realize it's really a simple process. It gets simpler as you go along with it. What looks like complicated is only because you're complicated or we're complicated. I love it. Every once in a while, somebody new will pick up the course, and they'll just kind of take to it like a duck to water, and they'll just sort of start getting it right away. And it has nothing to do with intellect. It has to do with the fact that they were emotionally prepared for it. They were just ready for this. They recognize. You recognize, oh my God, here it is. And I'm sure that that's true for some of you. Right? That you all of a sudden you recognize, oh, there is a way out. I mean, there is a truth. There's an opportunity here for us to really do what God would have us do with our lives. So this is a study, and we study it. That's why I'm actually call this a class, because that's what we're doing. We're in a class. We're studying. You have a textbook and a workbook, just like that's the workbook is the lab. This is the lab part of the whole process, right? Okay, page 2. Let me read a few of the quotes from the course that I've selected out. The crucifixion did not establish the atonement. The resurrection did. So let's talk a moment about what the atonement is. The atonement is God's plan for the undoing of the ego. This is really simple. I think one of the ways you can understand the atonement is a process. And it's a process of going back as we go forward. Right? So as we go forward, as we come to understand this deeper, again, we come home. But the thing is to be engaged in the process. That's why we have 365 lessons, because this is a slow process. It needs to be slow. You don't want to have happen what I had happen in 76. You don't want to wake up that way. It's much more, the course is nudging us awake. You know, it's like, wake up, wake up, wake up, wake up. You just want to nudge us into, but that feels good. It feels, I mean, how it is to, you wake up in the morning, you don't have to jump up and get up and, you know, but you can, it's Saturday morning or Sunday morning, and you don't have to go to work, and you can just sort of, you can wake up, but you do it gradually, and then it feels kind of nice. Oh, you can kind of roll back over again. Well, that's kind of the process. You just keep going through the process, but it is a process, continual awakening, and therefore remembering. And let me read another passage from this chapter. The forgiveness, this is on the top of page 2. Forgiveness literally transforms vision and lets you see the real world reaching quietly and, better go put my glasses on, quietly and gently across chaos, removing all illusions that had twisted your perception and fixed it on the past. That's one of the problems, that we just holding on to the past. We always, there's some problem in the past, and time is one of the great illusions, so there is no past. Even 5 minutes ago does not exist. Whatever hurt you think somebody did you once upon a time does not exist, unless you think it does, which means that you're holding on to it in your mind. It's not that there's any truth in it at all. And at some point we see that. You can imagine that in heaven there's no past. So what are you going to hold on to? That's why all the forgiveness is really very simple. And all it is, it just means letting go, period. Now, it may not be so easy to let go, but that's all we're doing. We're just letting go of something that we thought was real, that and it doesn't make any difference whether it's not to say that somebody literally, physically may hurt you, that may have happened. The question is, are you making an issue out of the fact that these things happen? You know, emotionally, physically, in any way. Let's go back to this one. The smallest leaf becomes a thing of wonder, a blade of grass, a sign of God's protection. And that's describing a mystical experience. You know, when you see that a leaf becomes a thing of wonder and a blade of grass is a sign of God's perfection, which would be true in anything and everything. But this is asking us to really be able to see the innocence, and to see the innocence means to be able to see the wholeness, which really also means to see that nothing happened. So we can see the innocence in our pets, in their eyes, and we can see the innocence in a baby. And I tell a story in here, some of you've read this, I'm sure, about the baby that was, this is back before cell phones. My mother has her baby out in the backyard on a blanket, and the phone rings in the house, and she rushes in and leaves the baby for what she thinks is just going to be a couple minutes, and gets on involved in the phone conversation, goes back out and finds that a snake is crawling up onto the blanket, and the baby has picked up the little snake, is shaking it like it's a rattle. So the innocent eye never saw any danger. There wasn't a problem there, right? Unless you see a problem there. If you see a problem there, you've got a problem.